It was a crisp autumn morning in the small town of Ridgewood when the news of Sarah Thompson's brutal murder sent shockwaves through the community. The town, known for its picturesque landscapes and close-knit neighborhoods, was now the backdrop to a chilling crime that would reveal a tangled web of obsession, betrayal, and murder. Sarah Thompson was a 28-year-old elementary school teacher, loved by everyone who knew her. With her kind smile and gentle nature, she was adored by her students and respected by her colleagues. Her life seemed perfect. She was recently married to John Peterson, a successful software engineer who had moved to Ridgewood just 2 years earlier. Their love story was the talk of the town, a whirlwind romance that had culminated in a beautiful wedding just 6 months prior. However, as idyllic as their life seemed, it hid dark secrets that would soon come to light. John, 32, was charming, intelligent, and deeply in love with Sarah, but his affection was not solely directed at his wife. From the moment he first met Sarah's younger sister, Emily, he felt an undeniable attraction. Emily, 26, was a freelance graphic designer, vibrant and full of life. Unlike Sarah's calm and nurturing demeanor, Emily was adventurous and free-spirited, traits that fascinated John from the start. He kept his feelings hidden, maintaining a facade of the perfect husband. But as time passed, his obsession with Emily grew. He found excuses to be around her, offering to help with her projects, and constantly texting her under the pretense of being a concerned brother-in-law. At first, Emily thought nothing of it, considering John's behavior as merely friendly. She had no idea of the storm brewing beneath his composed exterior. Sarah, always trusting and oblivious to the darker side of people's intentions, didn't notice the subtle signs of her husband's growing infatuation. She was busy with her job, their home, and planning a family. John's subtle advances towards Emily went unnoticed, and he took advantage of Sarah's trust to get closer to Emily. The turning point came during a family barbecue at the Thompsons' old country house. As the evening wore on and most of the guests had left, John found himself alone with Emily on the porch. Fueled by the warmth of the evening and a few too many drinks, he made an inappropriate remark about how he wished he had met her first. Emily, taken aback and uncomfortable, laughed it off, hoping it was a bad joke. But John's eyes told her a different story, one of yearning and obsession. She quickly excused herself and went inside, shaken by the encounter. She decided to keep the incident to herself, not wanting to cause a rift between her sister and her new husband. But John took her silence as a sign of complicity, emboldening him to pursue her more aggressively. He began sending her messages late at night, expressing his feelings and asking her to meet him secretly. Emily, horrified and afraid, tried to cut off contact, but John was persistent. His messages became more desperate and aggressive, hinting that he would leave Sarah if Emily gave him a chance. Meanwhile, Sarah remained blissfully unaware of the turmoil. She noticed Emily becoming more distant and John more restless, but she attributed it to the stress of their new life together. It never crossed her mind that her husband's attention might be directed elsewhere, much less towards her own sister. Emily's breaking point came when John cornered her at a local cafe. He confessed his love for her, pleading with her to give them a chance. He painted a picture of a life they could have together, far away from Ridgewood. Emily, trying to remain composed, rejected him firmly, telling him that his behavior was inappropriate and that he needed to focus on his marriage. John's face darkened with anger as she walked away, leaving him alone in the cafe, seething with rejection and humiliation. It was at that moment that his obsession took a dangerous turn. What had started as an infatuation had now morphed into something more sinister. He began to stalk Emily, following her from her apartment to her workplace. He would show up unexpectedly, lurking in the shadows, watching her every move. Emily was terrified, but didn't want to alarm Sarah, who was already under stress with her job and trying to start a family. Emily decided to confront John one last time, hoping to put an end to his disturbing behavior. She arranged to meet him in a public park, thinking it would be safe. But John had other plans. As she arrived, she found him waiting near the secluded end of the park, his eyes wild with a dangerous intensity she had never seen before. He pleaded with her again, tears streaming down his face, but Emily stood her ground. She told him she would tell Sarah everything if he didn't stop. Something snapped inside John. His love for Emily, twisted and corrupted, turned into a violent rage. In a blind fury, he grabbed her by the arm, his grip tight and painful. Emily struggled, shouting for him to let go, but he was beyond reason. He shoved her hard, and she stumbled back, hitting her head on a nearby bench. The impact left her dazed, blood trickling down her forehead. John panicked, realizing what he had done. He fled the scene, leaving Emily injured and alone in the darkening park. When Emily regained consciousness, she was disoriented and terrified. She managed to call a friend, who took her to the hospital. She decided to leave Ridgewood the next day, too scared to stay in a town where her sister's husband had nearly killed her. The following day, Sarah received a call that would change everything. Emily, with a heavy heart, told her sister about John's obsession and the attack in the park. Sarah was devastated and in disbelief, her world crumbling around her. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare. Sarah's world fell apart as she listened to Emily's trembling voice recount the horrifying events in the park. She felt a mixture of disbelief, anger, and guilt. How could she have been so blind to the danger lurking within her own home? She reassured Emily, promising to handle the situation and make sure she was safe. But the truth was, Sarah didn't know what to do. After the call, Sarah confronted John that evening. He was sitting in their living room, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes glazed over with a mix of fear and defiance. When she demanded to know the truth, he denied everything at first, his voice steady but his eyes betraying the panic within. Sarah pressed on, recounting Emily's story in detail. As she spoke, John's facade crumbled. His denials turned into anger, and he lashed out, accusing Emily of lying and trying to ruin their marriage. But Sarah knew better. She had seen the desperate texts on Emily's phone and felt the truth in her sister's voice. She demanded that John leave the house and give her time to think. He stormed out, slamming the door behind him. As he drove away, his mind raced with thoughts of anger and betrayal. He felt trapped, cornered, his life unraveling faster than he could control. Over the next few days, Sarah tried to reach out to Emily, but her calls went unanswered. She felt a gnawing fear in her gut, worried that something might have happened to her sister. She decided to go to Emily's apartment, only to find it empty. Emily had left Ridgewood without telling anyone where she was going. A wave of relief mixed with sadness washed over Sarah. At least Emily was safe, but she knew her sister was gone because of John's dangerous obsession. John, meanwhile, was spiraling deeper into his dark thoughts. He couldn't believe how quickly everything had fallen apart. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface was now boiling over. He felt betrayed not only by Emily, who had rejected him, but also by Sarah, who he believed had taken her sister's side. He was losing control, and he knew it, but instead of seeking help, he chose a darker path. One evening, John sat alone in their darkened home, staring blankly at a photo of Sarah and Emily taken during happier times. He downed another glass of whiskey, his mind fogged with alcohol and rage. He felt a cold clarity settle over him, a single, terrible solution to his problems. If Emily wasn't in Ridgewood anymore, if she had left to escape him, then it was Sarah's fault. She had turned his life into a living hell by siding with her sister. Fueled by a twisted sense of betrayal and vengeance, he made up his mind. Sarah would pay for what she had done. His obsession, once focused on Emily, had now transformed into a burning hatred for the woman he had once loved. He didn't see Sarah as his wife anymore, but as the obstacle standing in the way of his twisted fantasies. On the night of November 15th, 2008, John put his plan into motion. He waited until late in the evening, knowing that Sarah would be home alone. He knew she had been staying with her parents since their confrontation, but would return to the house occasionally to collect her things. He drove back to their home and parked a few streets away, his heart pounding as he walked towards the house. His hands were trembling, but his mind was clear. He He knew what he had to do. Sarah was in the kitchen, packing up the last of her belongings, when she heard the front door creak open. She froze, her heart racing. She called out, thinking it might be one of the neighbors or her parents, but there was no response. A chill ran down her spine as she heard footsteps approaching. John appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his eyes cold. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she saw the hatred burning in his eyes. She took a step back, instinctively clutching the countertop behind her. "John, what are you doing here?" Her voice was barely a whisper, fear lacing every word. He didn't answer. Instead, he took a step closer, and she saw the glint of a knife in his hand. Panic surged through her, and she backed away, her mind racing. She tried to reason with him, begging him to put the knife down, but he was beyond reason. He spoke, his voice eerily calm and detached. "You ruined everything, Sarah. You made her leave." Before she could react, he lunged at her. Sarah screamed, trying to dodge the attack, but the knife caught her arm, slicing through her skin. She stumbled, crashing into the kitchen table. The pain was sharp and blinding, but adrenaline fueled her. She grabbed a chair and swung it at John, hitting him in the chest. He staggered back, surprised by her resistance. Seizing the opportunity, Sarah ran towards the back door, her hands slippery with blood as she fumbled with the lock. She could hear John behind her, his footsteps heavy and fast. She managed to unlock the door and stumbled outside, her vision blurred with tears and pain. But John was faster. He grabbed her by the hair and yanked her back, throwing her onto the ground. She screamed, kicking and struggling, but he was relentless. He raised the knife, his face twisted in a mask of fury, and brought it down. The first stab pierced her shoulder, and she screamed in agony. The second, aimed at her chest, missed as she twisted away, her body convulsing with fear and pain. She tried to crawl away, her fingers digging into the cold, wet grass. But he was on her again, his weight pinning her down. John's mind was a blur of rage and desperation as he stabbed her again and again, each blow fueled by the twisted belief that this was the only way to end his suffering. Sarah's cries grew weaker with each stab until they faded into the cold night air, leaving only the sound of John's ragged breathing. He sat back, staring at the lifeless body of his wife, her blood pooling around her, soaking into the earth. The knife fell from his hand, and he felt a strange emptiness wash over him. The deed was done, and yet he felt no relief, no satisfaction, only a hollow, numbing silence. John stood over Sarah's lifeless body, his mind a tangled mess of shock and disbelief. The rage that had consumed him minutes ago dissipated, replaced by a sickening realization of what he had done. His hands, still clutching the blood-stained knife, trembled as he looked down at his wife, her face pale and eyes staring blankly into the night. He dropped the knife, stumbling backward, his heart pounding in his chest. Panic gripped him as he scanned the surroundings, his thoughts racing. He had to get away. He had to run. But as he turned to flee, the reality of his actions began to sink in. There was nowhere to go, no way to undo what he had just done. John staggered back into the house, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He collapsed onto the living room floor, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The house was eerily silent, save for the ticking of the wall clock, each second pounding in his ears like a drumbeat of guilt. His mind replayed the scene over and over, each detail more horrifying than the last. The look of terror on Sarah's face, the way she had begged him to stop, the blood that had poured from her wounds. He felt nauseous, his stomach churning as he realized the full extent of his actions. But there was no going back. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, destroyed the life of the woman he had once loved, and any hope of redemption. His obsession had consumed him, leading him down a path of no return. As he sat there, staring blankly at the floor, he heard the distant wail of sirens growing louder. Someone must have heard the commotion and called the police. He felt a surge of fear, his instincts screaming at him to run, to hide, but his body refused to move. He was paralyzed by the weight of his own guilt, unable to tear himself away from the scene of his crime. The sirens grew louder, closer, and then they were outside, flashing blue and red lights illuminating the front yard. John barely registered the sound of the car doors slamming or the hurried footsteps approaching the house. He was lost in a fog of despair, his mind numb and unresponsive. The front door burst open, and the police officers rushed in, their guns drawn, shouting orders. John barely looked up as they approached him, his eyes vacant, his hands still stained with Sarah's blood. He didn't resist as they pulled him to his feet, cuffing his hands behind his back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, but he felt nothing. They dragged him outside, the cool night air hitting his face like a slap. The neighbors had gathered, their faces pale and horrified as they watched the scene unfold. John didn't meet their eyes, didn't acknowledge their whispers and gasps. He kept his gaze on the ground, his mind blank, his heart heavy with the weight of his actions. As they shoved him into the back of the police car, he caught a glimpse of Sarah's body, still lying in the backyard, illuminated by the harsh beam of the police lights. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut, the finality of it all crashing down on him. He closed his eyes, leaning his head back against the seat, a single tear sliding down his cheek. The drive to the station was a blur. The officers' voices, the crackle of the radio, the hum of the engine, all of it faded into the background as John sat there, numb and broken. He knew there would be no forgiveness, no redemption. He had destroyed everything that mattered, all for a twisted obsession that had led to unimaginable horror. At the station, they led him to a small, stark interrogation room. The walls were bare, the lights harsh, and the silence oppressive. They left him there, alone, his thoughts spiraling into a dark abyss. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. He couldn't tell. Time had lost all meaning. When the detective finally entered, John didn't look up. He didn't need to hear the accusations or the questions. He knew what he had done, knew that there was no escape from the truth. He was a murderer, a monster, and there was nothing left to say. He simply nodded when asked if he understood his rights, his voice a hollow whisper as he confessed to everything. Every detail, every moment of that horrifying night spilled out of him, his words empty and devoid of emotion. There was no point in lying, no reason to hide. His life was over, and all that remained was the aftermath of his destruction. As they led him away to his cell, the full weight of his actions settled over him like a suffocating blanket. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, haunted by the memory of the woman he had loved and destroyed in the same breath. His obsession had consumed him, and now it had damned him to a lifetime of darkness and regret.